introduce. I'm Sue Cooper, member of the Garden Club. I don't know if anybody knows, we have a little donation box there because we are unable to do our plant sale this year to help raise money to fund the flowers on the corner. Mainly because we don't want to spread. None of us have them, but we don't want to take any chances of spreading jumping worms from one house to the other. And I will introduce now Bernie Williams. She is from the Extension Office, right? DNR. And she's the expert on jumping worms, so she's going to fill us in all about, and she loves worms, so she's going to fill us in all about the worms.
And I don't know if we can get the lights because my slides are much better in the dark.
Okay.
Worms look better in the dark.
I don't know which lights I will figure it out.
Yep, that's perfect.
How's that?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So thank you for coming tonight, and I'll try and answer any questions that you have about worms. I do like worms. I've spent 15 years of my life with worms. I'm on a count now, and it all started because I used to work at the Milwaukee Public Museum, and I used to work with a herpetologist, and we started to look at what snakes were predating upon, and we stumbled into worms, and since that time I've been with worms ever since. So these worms up here are all European earthworms, so these are not the Asian earthworms, and the one thing that I will say that not all worms are created equally, and you'll find that out tonight. The first question that I generally ask people is, why do you think you like earthworms? Well, I like earthworms just because I've spent so much time with them, but I also like them because they do a lot of amazing things. One of the things that you like is that they compost waste. So we're all gardeners in here, so we're looking to compost, and vermicomposting is really important these days because it's providing a way to recycle everything. The other reason is that, well, it's finally spring here in Wisconsin. We've been waiting a really long time, and the robins arrived about a month ago, and then when we had that snowstorm, just about 3 weeks ago, everybody was worried about the robins. I know I was out there crushing suet, thawing berries, and doing everything because I was worried about all of these migrating birds. And they're great. So if you've ever seen a robin like tilt its head, it can hear actually the vibration of the earthworms moving around in there. So and it's not just birds that eat earthworms. A lot of other animals are always consuming them too. So I'll tell you a couple of cool things about other animals at the end of the talk. You'll never quite look at them the same way again. They also provide that organic material. So earthworms are nature's recyclers. So we want them, and they can do incredible things. And when you're looking at earthworms in an organic setting or in your garden or in an urban environment, I wouldn't worry about them because they're actually providing more good things to the soil than doing disruptive things. They also provide fertilizer, and we'll talk about fertilizer, so that fertilizer load that they can add that enhances growth of a lot of plants, trees, you name it, they can do. That fertilizer is key, but the number one reason why you like earthworms is why? They're just all around super cool animals, which they are. These are really incredible animals. They're ancient animals. You will never think of an earthworm the same way again once I'm done with you tonight. So roughly 50 minutes, we'll see how your perception of them changes. They're not just squiggly, and they don't get stuff on you. They're super cool animals. The other reason why you may want to reconsider how you feel about earthworms, well, we're in Wisconsin and we don't have any native earthworms here. So all earthworms in Wisconsin are invasive species. And if you work at the DNR or you work at the Extension Office or you're out in your garden right now, you're seeing garlic mustard coming up. You're seeing all those rosettes of all those annoying weedy things. Those are invasives. Well, earthworms they fall in that same category. They're invasive species. But who's that other invasive species out there that it causes all the problems? No? Who's that number one invasive species out there that causes all the problems? Us! Because wherever we go, we bring stuff with us. So we are the rats that are bringing all of these other invasives with us. So humans and earthworms have a lot in common. We're always together, and we're always doing things we probably shouldn't be doing, but we do it anyway. So They also upset soil chemistry. So depending on what you're growing, so we were talking about forestry. You had no idea that the forest industry in Wisconsin was so big, but it's a huge industry. You go past Stevens Point and boom, you're in a forest industry. And we have quite a bit of forestry going on in southern Wisconsin too, but most people don't realize that we have such a huge forest industry in the state. But I work in forestry, so I look at how earthworms affect the soil. I also look at how earthworms affect other animals and plants, when you're growing, because ideally you want diversity. Wherever you're growing anything, whether it be a crop, whether it be you're growing trees, you want diversity in the soil, you want diversity in the understory, because diversity is really the spice of life. And if you have too many earthworms, they can really upset that, because earthworms are hungry. They're always eating, and they can really change things. Quick example of the North Woods. So if you go to the North Woods, you always hear the ovenbird. The ovenbird is a ground nesting bird, but you can actually see declines in areas where there's not that many ovenbirds anymore because there's too many earthworms in there and they're consuming that organic material, and so it prohibits them from making those nests, those ground nests that they need. So there's multiple effects in that way as well. The other things, they damage forest. So we know when we talk about European earthworms that you can look at an earthworm, that nightcrawler. So the nightcrawler, the Lumbricus terrestris, is my favorite earthworm, hands down. It's an amazing worm, but when you're looking at it and there's too many of them and you have them in a forested setting, they can really change and disrupt the organic material in that forest system and how the fungus breaks down and how it feeds the soil. And if there's not enough organic material for them to feed on, they'll actually start feeding on those feeder roots of those trees, and they can really destabilize an old growth forest very quickly because there's not enough food for them, so they start feeding on any available resource. All right, the fun part. Who opened the can of worms? So who opened the can of worms? This is an overused expression. The overused expression, it goes back to one individual in particular, and that one individual in particular, you may know him. He was a little-known marine biologist way back in the day, and he studied primarily barnacles. But this individual wrote the Earthworm Bible, and that would be Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin, the Earthworm Bible, is the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms, and Charles Darwin considered earthworms the most influential animal on Earth. I would disagree with him and say that we are probably the most influential animal on Earth, followed closely by the earthworms, because we tend to go hand in hand together. But when Charles Darwin wrote the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms, and try and say that 3 times fast, this was near the end of his life, so it was published 6 months before his death. This was also the Victorian era. So how many of you watch Victoria on PBS in the fall and in the winter? Oh, you can put more hands up than that, because you all just flipped through it and you saw it. The Victorians were game changers. They changed how the world worked and how it looked and how it operated. So when you're looking at this, the Victorians, they were huge gardeners. They loved to garden, and they liked things to grow big and fast and quickly. But they also had worms, because you're in England. And when they were looking at worms, and they looked at Charles Darwin's book, and they thought, well, he's foolish, because we removed the earthworms from the soil, because they thought they were a pest of the soil. It was through Charles Darwin's study, because it took him 40 years of studying earthworms to compile all of this data and to write this book, that it changed public perception, and Charles Darwin was able to worm his way into their heart. So the other really interesting thing, when you're looking at invasives across a whole, so how many of you are familiar with Japanese knotweed? Knotweed. That looks like that bamboo that's all over the place. Right. The Victorians introduced it, okay? So they're responsible for that. They really liked it. They also introduced giant hogweed. So some of you are getting really concerned about giant hogweed. July, you start calling the DNR and you start telling us about these giant plants that are 10 feet tall. The Victorians did that too. And a lot of these plants were encouraged because they were changing and altering the soil system there, because they were removing all the earthworms. So there's a lot of different things that play out over and over. It's sort of a vicious cycle when we get into the story of invasives. Now, earthworms are ubiquitous to all areas of the world. So when you look at them, we say that there's 9,000 species, but there's 9,000 species and counting. Because believe it or not, there are not a whole lot of earthworm biologists out there. And I know you find that very hard to believe. Like with this fascinating animal, you would think there would just be lines everywhere. Like, oh, I'm going to study earthworms. But the earthworms that you're familiar with generally tend to be just this guy right over here, so a lumbricid species. And really, they're an exciting species, but when you compare them to some of the aquatic and the other ones, they're kind of dull in their appearance, right? They're not very exciting. You're going to be excited about it once I'm done with you, because it's a fascinating animal. But you look at them aquatic, you look at them terrestrial. There's all sorts of things that I could tell you about worms, but we don't have enough time tonight. But they're all over the place, and they can do amazing things, and they come in a variety of colors, shapes, sizes, and just cool altogether. When you look at them, they're annelids, so they're segmented. So anytime you're looking at an animal that's segmented, it's an annelid. So you can see like the segmented spot. Sometimes when I give this talk, I wear a striped shirt, so you can see yourself. You're segmented, and they emerge from the oceans, and they're very ancient species. So you're all gardeners, so you like plants, so you can look at the age of plants. Well, earthworms, they're some of the oldest, and the fossil records of them 600, 700 million years old, so they've been around for a very long time. And then you start going down the historical record, and you can see that they predate fungus and land plants. So then you think a little bit further, and you think, well, what came next? So the dinosaurs and mammals. And then, of course, we came on the scene, but who was here to begin with? Earthworms. So aquatic, emerging from the water, and we have terrestrial, but very ancient species, so they deserve a lot of respect when you're looking at them historically. Worms in Wisconsin. How many of you are native Wisconsinites? Okay, so a lot of you. All right, so when you're in Wisconsin, I have this debate with my husband frequently. He calls a hill a mountain. Those are hills, those are not mountains. If you've ever seen a mountain, Wisconsin's pretty flat. So, and you look at this because there was a glacier that moved across Wisconsin. And this glacier, retreated roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. And when it retreated, it took that down to bedrock. And so anything that occurred after the glacier retreated occurred without the presence of earthworms. Whereas you can have plant seeds, you can have a lot of different things that can hang out sort of frozen, dormant in that state. And they're going to reemerge after the glacier has retreated. But earthworm cocoons, because earthworms shed cocoons, they weren't going to survive that long, 10,000 years under the ice. So what we look at the history of all these plants without the occurrence of earthworms. And the other thing that people will say, because people will always ask, well, what about that area, the driftless area, the mountainous area of Wisconsin? Now, I'm from the hills and hollers of Pennsylvania, and that is not a mountainous area. So I don't know what people are talking about when they call the driftless area mountains, because you've never seen a mountain, obviously, because that is a hill. So no earthworms in that area either. And there were previous glaciers that moved through there too. So we just don't have native North American earthworms. The earthworms that we do have are European species of earthworms. And they came with what? Us. So they came with all the settlers. They came with everyone else. They came with all the plants that you were bringing from the old world into the new world. It came with the cutover of the forest. It came with settlement. So we were always introducing these things, and it continues to happen on a daily basis. Now, when you look at functional groups of earthworms, because you've been in the soil, so you brought some. I really like the pink-nosed worm, the Apricotida. It's a cute little worm. It's the first ones you see, but we look at the soil and we divide it. So we put them into functional groups. So the first ones that you're always going to see are the epigeic species. So they're always hanging out in the litter. And then you're going to see the endogeic species, and they tend to be in the topsoil. And then you get ones that will sort of float in between the epigeic species and the endogeic species, and we call them epiendi species. And then you have my favorite, which are the asciic species. And so these are the night crawlers. These tend to be the lumbricid species, and these are amazing animals. How many of you have ever put a night crawler on a fishing hook? All right, well, I'm going to make you feel really guilty when I'm done with you, because these are cool animals, and they're long-lived animals, and they can do amazing things, and you'll be amazed. All right, so when you're looking at them, remember, 3 groups, so horizontal and vertical, that they're in the soil column. And if you're ever doing an earthworm survey, they tend to take about 10 to 15 minutes because you have to wait for everybody to come up because they're not all just there. And that nightcrawler right there, how far do you think he goes in the soil column?
2, 3 feet, 4 feet.
6 to 10 feet. So 6 to 10 feet. And remember, he's an annelid, so he can move himself up and down. So, you know, all those segments, you know, he's been doing ab work, so he can really go up and down through the soil. All right, so the ecology of earthworms. How many of you are going to go home and order The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms on Amazon Prime when you get home? No one? All right, so if you don't want to do that, you can read, and you're at the library today, so you can read There's a Hair in My Dirt, and it's by Gary Larson. Gary Larson actually, before he became a famous cartoonist, was a biologist. So this book is completely correct, and it's a great book. I have multiple copies at my desk at work, but it really explains how everything starts to decay, how earthworms work in the system, how fungus works in the system. But earthworms turn over everything. They're turning over organic material. The cool thing I will tell you about earthworms, so we'll use the nightcrawler as a quick example. When you're looking at an earthworm, earthworms have preferences, so they like different foods over others. So what Charles Darwin proved was that earthworms, they sense things, and so he actually ran tests of showing well, they preferred strawberries over grapes. They preferred maple leaves over other leaves. And then you're in the forest in Wisconsin, so our state tree is the sugar maple. You can go out to a sugar maple if you're in a worm-infested area, and you can see earthworms become really active in the fall when the sugar maples start to fall to the forest floor. And the earthworm will actually come up, grab onto the leaf, and say that it grabs onto the side of the leaf. It'll actually move it around in its mouth over to the tip of the leaf, and then it'll pull that leaf down into its hole and consume it that way because they want to get the most sugar and carbohydrates for it. And then once they get to the petiole, the stem, they'll push it out because that's like the broccoli stem. They don't want anything to do with that. So if you're walking through a forest, if you see these clumps of all the petioles there, grab onto it, you'll get some resistance, pull it up, and you'll see a little borehole right in there, and that generally is a nightcrawler. So one little tidbit about them. Now, earthworm biology, this is my favorite slide because I could talk about earthworm biology all day long because it's the most fascinating thing that ever happens. Earthworms are promiscuous polygamous hermaphrodites, and some reproduce parthenogenically. Are we good? Everybody there? So in a nutshell, earthworms are social animals. They're very social animals. They like one another's company. So when people are calling now and they tell me oh, there's all these worms, and I was out in the garden late putting in things and there were worms all over the place and they were stuck together or they were in balls, I tell them, well, it's the most exciting time of the year. It is earthworm mating season because in spring, just like across the board for all animals, it's mating season. And earthworms, they've been underground below the frost line all winter long, so they want to get out, they want to socialize, they want to see what's been going on, so they come out and they mate. And when you're looking at the body of an earthworm, this earthworm right here, how many of you are under the guise that if you cut an earthworm in half, you'll get 2? All right, no one? All right, so that's good. I'm glad to hear that because that isn't true. So when you're looking at the earthworm, everything important right here is the clitellum. So everything important in the earthworm is happening right there in the clitellum. And if you were to go into a quick trip or a BP after this talk tonight or sometime this week and you're just curious and you see that bait refrigerator in the back of the store and you think, should I go and look because there's going to be a lot of night crawlers that I can go in there and just walk over to the corner, be that strange person that I frequently am and just open up that refrigerator and pop out one of those containers of the 12-pack. And you can actually pull out the earthworm in there, and you'll see that, if you look above that clitellum, you'll actually see two little pores and 2 more little pores. So it's like 2 dots, 2 dots. Those are the male pores, those are the female pores, and that's the clitellum. And when earthworms are mating, they stick together like this. So they're self-fertilizing because they're hermaphrodites, so they have to mate in this manner. And when you pick up that earthworm, do you often get that slime on you? So that slime is actually nitrogen. That's why farmers really like earthworms in their soil, because it's providing nitrogen to the soil and it's really feeding the soil. That's why in Wisconsin we're working with NRCS, because we'd like to have a lot of agricultural fields move to no-till practices. If you allow these worms to do what they do best, you'll have bigger yields eventually, because they will turn over all of that organic material. When you tend to go out and you till all the time, you damage your soil. Let nature do what it's meant to do. They may not be native, but they can really provide a product. So they're providing their services to you free, and they're feeding your soil, and eventually you'll get bigger crop yields. But when you're looking at this, one thing that you should keep in mind, how long do you think those earthworms stick together like that? Not a couple minutes. How about a couple hours? So they stay together like that. They're fertilizing one another. And it's sometimes if you're really, really lucky, I mean, you might be able to do it sometime this week because it's been a lot of wet weather. You can drive by a culvert, just slow down, park the car, get out, walk over and peek into the culvert. And sometimes if you're lucky, the moon's aligned, you'll be able to see hundreds of these worms sort of roiling together. They're socializing, they're mating, and you just want to reach down, pull up. It's nirvana. Anyway, so I've spent a lot of time with worms, so I can say that, but they're amazing animals. And the other thing, when you're looking at these earthworms, so let's go back, we'll say that this is the nightcrawler. How long do you think the lifespan of a nightcrawler is?
Just one year, isn't it?
No, a nightcrawler. So
okay.
a nightcrawler. So that nightcrawler. 8 to 10 years. So now you're going to feel a little guilty when you put them on the hook. You're going to be like, well, what have you been doing? Can you tell me? I mean, because, if you talk to a 10-year-old, they can tell you a lot. So that worm could tell you a lot, too. They are long-lived animals, and they shed cocoons. After they're mating, so they're fertilized. So you can see that, earthworms, we say they shed cocoons, and they do shed cocoons, because each part of the body of an earthworm, so those segments on that body, that slime, which is that nitrogen slime, is part of the reproductive system. So it sort of moves like a hula hoop back and forth over segments of the body of the worm, and then it slides off the clitellum and off the head, and it drops these beautiful little cocoons into the soil. So it's an animal that gives birth off of its head. How many animals do you know that can do that? Not many. So again, amazing animals. All right. Couple ones that you're going to see because they're widespread within Wisconsin. So this is the little guy that you were concerned about earlier. This little guy. He's a cute little worm. He's all over in the soil. He always has that little pink nose, so you can see his little pink nose there, and so you can say, oh no, that's the pink nose worm. And then when you're looking at composting, when you hear people talking about composting, a lot of times they're using the dendrobana species, so just the leaf worm. And then the lumberkid species, which are all over the state. You can find them just about anywhere. You can find them in the Quick Trip, you can find them in the BP, you can find them in your garden. But the nightcrawler, which is Lumbricus terrestris, and then the red leaf worm, which is Lumbricus rubellus, they're in the same family. They're big, and you can always know that that's them, but just amazing worms altogether. But you notice these little golden orbs right here, these are the cocoons. And if you're a gardener and you know what you're looking for in your soil, they're going to pop out at you. So particularly with the nightcrawler, you can see their cocoons because you're going to look at the soil and then you'll see these they almost look like little golden pearls with a slight teardrop shape to them. If you put one of those in your hand, you apply a little bit of pressure, out will pop a little worm. So, and the life cycle of these worms, which is important to understand when you compare them to the jumping worms, is that they're long-lived animals. And so generally any cocoons of a nightcrawler or a red wiggler or anything like that, it's going to take them anywhere from 120 to 90 days to reach maturity before they can mate and shed cocoons. So generally when the cocoons that you're seeing now, they're not going to reach maturity. They're going to reach maturity at the end of the growing season. Then they're going to estivate, so they're going to go down below the frost line and they won't become active and start shedding cocoons until the next growing season. And that's completely different than that of a jumping worm. because remember, they're going to live depending on the species. So the pink nose worm, generally lifespan anywhere from 3 to 4 years. Same with the dendrobana, 3 to 4 years. But the lumberkids, they generally are around 8 to 10 years in the soil column. So they're long-lived animals, which makes them different than the jumping worms. And that's what I want to hammer home to you when you talk about, when you compare the two of them. Now, if earthworms are so widespread, why are they a problem? I'll just give you a quick example of the forest. So since I work in forestry, I want to try to make people understand. So when you're looking at an earthworm is going to change its environment to suit its survival. Who does that sound like? Us. So when you're looking at a forest, and do this when you're walking around, if you're looking in a disturbed area, or you happen to go to any of some of the closest state forests here, you would go to Lapland Peak in Waukesha, go to the northern Kettle, the southern Kettle moraines, and you can see that, you don't see a lot of diversity in the understory. Because when you walk through a lightly infested area, it's going to have lots of diversity. It's going to have build-up leaf litter of years of build-up leaf litter, and it's slowly decaying and feeding the soil, and that's what you want to happen. But when you have a lot of earthworms in there, you have little diversity. You get more garlic mustard, Dame's rocket, parsnip, all of these ones that we battle on. Anytime it starts to get warm, everybody starts seeing all the invasives, because earthworms are disrupting that mutualistic relationship with the fungus in the soil. Earthworms are consuming that organic material. They can cause erosion. They can cause a lot of different things. So if you want just a quick guide, like, are there earthworms there? If you don't see any build-up leaf litter, you don't see a lot of diversity, you just see like a monoculture of something running through there, it tends to be that earthworms are going to be part of that cycle too. And just to give you a little quiz, does this look healthy? No. So this is a forested stand up in Oneida County, up in the northern Highlands, American Legion Forest. So we had a forester call and say, hey, can you take a look at this picture? What's going on here? Well, there's a couple things going on there. There's, I don't see any uneven age management. I don't see any seedlings. So if you're walking through a maple forest, you should have just a flood of seedlings in the understory. There should be diversity of other species in there, but I only see what looks like a grass. And that's not grass, that's Pennsylvania sedge, which happens to be a native sedge, because Wisconsin is the sedge capital of the world. But sedge and earthworms are sort of in this unique relationship where, once the earthworms have primed the soil, the sedge will move in because that's what's around, so it takes up that place. And then earthworms tend to stay away from it because they don't like to eat the roots of sedge because it has a silica component of it, and they don't like that. It's not palatable to them. But anytime you see a forested scene like that, it may look lush and green, but remember, what you're always looking for is diversity. And you always want to see all these uneven aged trees, because if you were to go in there and you were going to harvest that, well, what's going to come up? Because you don't have any seed trees. You don't have any seedlings. So while it looks beautiful, just get that idea in your head. Like, when I see something like that and I don't see diversity, earthworms can play a big factor in why these things look this way. And another thing that we'll point out to people is when you start to see trees that almost look like they're on stilts, like they're ready to walk out of the forest, that's compaction, because earthworms can cause a lot of compaction in a natural setting when you're trying to grow trees. So that's why when you talk to a DNR forester or a federal forester, they are well versed in earthworms. They know that they can have a huge role in how these different species are growing. And just to give you another quick example, so this up here, this is castings of rubella. So they tend to make this one distinctive signature of earthworm poop, essentially. And so you can say, oh, that's rubellus in there. But if you're ever doing an earthworm survey, you always want variety, and you always will tend to get variety of different species that come up when you do an earthworm survey, and they'll all sort of flush up to the surface, because remember, the biology of an earthworm is that it breathes through its skin. So anytime you've been seeing all of these worms all over the place, on the pavement, on the sidewalks, really on the surface of your garden, it's because they're coming up to breathe, because all of that water is drowning them, because their body itself acts as their lung. And just another example, this is what you want to see. You should always see a flush of understory growth. And depending on the species of earthworms there, it can give you telltale signs of why things are happening in that forest. All right, so we'll take a breath. So there's nothing more exciting than earthworms, right? Right. All right, so that's not very enthusiastic. So, all right, so the other worms that people call and ask questions about and that you're worried about and you suspended your plant cell are the jumping worms. And these are Amenthus species. And so this is, when we look at restricted things, and we have a legislative rule within Wisconsin, it's called Legislative Rule NR40, and it categorizes invasive species, anything from, plants to trees to shrubs, diseases, funguses, insects. We have a rule so we can classify it so we can get better control of it. Originally, when we found these worms in the Arboretum in 2013, they were classified as a prohibited species because we didn't think that they would be able to survive the climate of Wisconsin. When we found them, we realized that we were definitely wrong about that. But with science, you frequently will find that you're wrong about a number of things that you theorize are true, but they're not. The thing about these worms, when you're looking at them, they look completely different than European species of earthworms. So you can see that clitellum on them. One thing that you always want to look for is that clitellum is much closer to the head of the body of the worm than the clitellum on European earthworms. The clitellum on European earthworms always tends to be slightly off-center on the body of the worm. And the clitellum on this will always completely encircle the body of the worm, so it'll be smooth to the body. There won't be any distinguishable like male and female pores on there. It will connect, whereas on European earthworms, the clitellum is always split. So there's big differences in there. And when you look at them, you can see their appearance is much different than that of a European earthworm. So having spent many years with earthworms, I'll frequently describe them as really, they're handsome worms. They're clean, they're dynamic, they're tough, they're firm. They've been exercising a lot because they really are tough. So if you're holding that worm in your hand, with a European, it'll sort of flip-flop. It stretches itself out. Not this guy. This guy will remain tough, turgid between your fingers, and you'll be able to squeeze it, and there's not much give. So my analogy, since we're in Wisconsin, is that its texture is like a slightly overstuffed bratwurst. So it's just tough. It's almost in a casing there. We know that they've been in North America for quite a while. When you look at the historical records, the first historical records are back at the turn of the century. But again, not a lot of people have been paying attention and really focused on earthworms. When we look at them in Wisconsin, they have definitely been here much longer than when we first found them in the Arboretum. I would say they've probably been in the state anywhere from 20 to 15 years, given their spread. It's just that most people really don't look at a worm and think, oh, that's, it's another worm. They think a worm is a worm, but this is a completely different worm than European earthworms. We consider them the secondary invasion. And, I could talk at length about European earthworms and tell you their historical references, where they came from, where they're endemic. But with these, it's sort of a broad net we cast. We know that they're from the Korean Peninsula, but they're also part of China and areas of Japan where they're from. And originally we thought that there were probably 50 species within the genus. Now we know that there's probably over 130 species within the genus. And when you're looking at that, there's a lot that we don't understand about them. They're very difficult to identify as well. There's a variety of them. We know that we have 3 species of them currently in the state, but I know that there's other species here. It's just that we haven't identified them down to that species yet. When you look at them, the characteristics, they're darker, they're glossy. That clitellum is always sort of milky white to gray. They're active, so when we call them jumping worms, it's not so much that they jump, it's that they move like a snake and they're really active and they can throw themselves. So they really will, if you pick up a handful of them, they will spin and do anything to get away from you. Whereas, a European earthworm, they're not going to do anything like that. I mean, some of them may be a little active when they're mating, but they don't spin and jump and flip and get away from you, move like a snake to do so. Some of them can break their tail. The tail will keep moving and then the body will just keep going too. So they're very aggressive in that manner too. The other thing about them is that they're parthenogenic. So these are asexual. They're not going to mate like the European earthworms. When you say like, well, they're, earthworms are social. There's a lot of these, I'm not necessarily sure that they're social. It's just that there's so many of them, they're all over the place. They tend to form in mass and to be in infestations. And so it's a whole different worm when you're looking at it. The other thing, why they're a problem for us is that when you look at the life cycle of them, they reach maturity really quickly. And because they're asexual, they're not mating. So once they reach maturity, they can start shedding cocoons. And they shed a lot of cocoons during their lifespan. So, say we wouldn't have had that, and I'm sure we'll have some microclimates which occurred, but we had a lot of snow. So where those are, where the Amynthus are, where we know that the populations of jumping worms are, so it's pretty early in their life stage right now, because any ones that were hatching prior to that snow that we had were probably sort of damaged, wiped out, and so more cocoons had to hatch. And so right now people are calling and they're interested, but you really won't start seeing adult worms in the soil until the end of June, because they were sort of set back. And we know that this occurs, but we also know there's microclimates in nurseries, in hoop houses, under mulch piles. So there will be differences across the board. I don't suspect that we'll really get people calling really concerned about them, that they're seeing lots of them all at once until mid-July, because if you're just following the weather patterns and what's been happening, it would indicate that we won't get lots of reports until July. They're adaptive, so when you're looking at them, when we map them in the Arboretum, you can walk through all areas of the Arboretum and you can see that they really tended to first occur where there was a lot of disturbance by people, where they were putting down mulch, where they would bring in nursery stock, where there was a lot of disturbance by people moving through. But as they've continued to map, and hopefully another grad student will continue mapping where the last one stopped, it's a progression, so they keep moving. We found them in turf, but in lower populations, in maple stands at higher populations. We really haven't found them in Curtis Prairie, so it'll give you an indication that they really don't like that dry texture. When you're looking at how they survive, all the worms, so if you call the DNR in September and you say, well, I have all these worms everywhere, what am I going to do? Well, you're going to wait for the frost to come, because the frost is going to kill them all. Because they're not long-lived animals, they're really sort of like the marigold of the earthworm world. They're here for one season and one season only, but what they leave behind are the cocoons. And when you're looking at your soil, another thing to keep in mind is look at your soil. So if your soil starts to get this signature to it where it's really crumbly, it almost looks like tapioca pudding pearls, it doesn't clump together, that's a good indicator for you too. Another unique thing about these worms is that once you get a population of them, you tend to see a decline and disappearance of European earthworms. So whereas European earthworms, you tend to get anywhere from 6 to 9 different species when you do an earthworm survey, and they all live in harmony together, they get along, they do their own thing in different areas of the soil. These worms tend to push them out. And we're not quite sure why they push them out or what the long-term effect of this, but you won't have the diversity of the earthworms anymore. You'll only have jumping worms. So they're almost like we've compared it at the DNR when you get a lot of garlic mustard. Garlic mustard moves through really quickly and it releases an allelopath to your soil, so almost like a chemical, which prevents other plants from establishing. They sort of act in the same way, that they're releasing something which is preventing the other European earthworms from being there. So it's something unique that happens that we don't quite understand. Comparing them, because there's a big difference in how they appear. So this is Amynthus and this is Rubellus. So this is your red wiggler. So you can see that their appearance is very different. That clitellum is close to the head, whereas the clitellum on the red wiggler is, you know, sort of mid-center, off-center, and red, and so fleshy. You can feel the texture, you can see the texture, much more defined segments on the body, where you can see with the jumping worm, it's tough. And so if you were to hold it between your fingers, it would sort of move like this, whereas this one would sort of flop over. So just to use to say like this worm is always working out and this one is sort of lackluster in doing the sit-ups. This one's always doing sit-ups so it can do just about anything, where this one is like, I'm just going to hang out. So very different in how they appear. Two species in particular, so the first two that were identified correctly are Amynthus tokiensis and Amynthus agrestis. And you can see that they're both Amynthus species, so they fall under that taxonomic umbrella, but there's a big difference in size. So we do get ones that are quite large and then other ones that are pretty small, but we know for sure we have these two. And then when you're looking at the cocoons, because frequently master gardeners, homeowners, they'll say, well, how can I see the cocoons? Well, you can't see the cocoons. The cocoons of these are not like European earthworms. They're not golden. They're really hard to identify because they tend to look like a sesame seed. So like not a sesame seed, a poppy seed. They're really tiny, they're dark, and so this soil went through a screen several times just to isolate down that one cocoon, and I have it lit up there. But if you were a gardener looking for cocoons in the soil, you really wouldn't be able to identify that. And to take it down a step further, you can see how the cocoons appear. And Metaphyre hilgedorfi is the newest one that we identified for a species, which occurred last September when we did a citizen science where a lot of people fanned out over Madison and they visited houses that had reported having jumping worms. And so we were able to identify Metaphyre hilgedorfi, but I don't have a picture of it, but it tends to look very similar to agrestis. It's a larger jumping worm. But you can see those cocoons, just poppy seeds in your soil. So when we talk to plant groups, you canceled your plant sale this year. One thing to keep in mind is that when you're looking at this, so if you get your roots clean, and you don't have any, you don't see any soil on there, you don't see any dark spots, the cocoons themselves need the medium of the soil to move. So, it's not that you're 100% safe, but you're pretty safe if your roots look clean. And we've had numerous garden groups, plant sales that continue in Milwaukee and Waukesha, because it's beneficial. And we don't have the cure, the magic bullet for these worms yet, so we don't discourage, we encourage best management practices. So as we face new invasives, and there are new invasives that come every day that we're going to be battling, we want you to look at it sort of like this is another one that we're going to have to deal with, learn about as we go. But just to give you a visual of what the cocoons look like. The one thing we will say, which is very true, so if you're a gardener and you take home a plant that is, that has had Amynthus move through the soil or has been in an area where there's been an infestation. So this is one of this was in the nursery of the Arboretum, and these plants, they were all going to be sold that spring in the plant sale, but they all gave the telltale characteristics that Amynthus had moved through there, because you can see the soil signature. So the likelihood of having cocoons in that plant, if you took it home, are pretty high, and you would give yourself some worms, because remember, it only takes one cocoon to start a population, which is very true. For many people can tell you, well, I never had them, and then I bought this and I put it in and now I have them. So getting them, you just need to be cautious in how you approach this. To give you a visual of when I say that these worms are not like other worms, they become an infestation. So a few years ago, I had a landowner call me on a Friday afternoon, and she had called the urban forester, and she had worms everywhere. She had had a lot of landscaping done the previous year, and they had brought in a lot of fill, they had brought in a lot of plants, and she had worms just pouring out of her rocks, pouring out of her garden. They were down her driveway, they were all along the street. And it was amazing. I thought it was really cool. She was very upset because there were worms everywhere. And that's when we have a species sort of fall under that umbrella that this is an infestation. But it really does look like this. And, if you go out in September, when you potentially have 2 generations of them, you can just go out and you can scoop them up by the handfuls and just put them in a bucket. And I will say my one warning a few years ago when I was out collecting on a Friday, I had a bucket and I had multiple containers, and I took them back to my cube at the DNR and I poked holes in the tops of all of them. And I thought, well, they'll be fine. I'll come back on Monday and I'll deal with them. When I came back in on Monday, all the people in my aisle were waiting for me because they had escaped. They had popped the lids on all those containers, and there were worms all down the aisle in other people's cubes, in the chairs, on the desk. They were out by the elevator. So when we say, because we originally called them crazy worms, it's crazy what these worms can do. They're very active, and they must work together to get those lids off. But it hasn't just happened to me, it's happened to other people too. And yeah, so you be careful with these worms when you're dealing with them. How they're moving, well, we know that it's passive, that these are moving in the nursery trade. So ask questions. We know that they can move in plant cells. We know that they can move in soils, landscaping practices, mulch, nurseries, and we've reached out to them. And all nurseries in Wisconsin, if you're a licensed nursery, remember they are regulated by DATCAP, the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, and there are multiple nursery inspectors that span out over the state and do inspections weekly. Mulch your gardeners, so you know that you see these piles, and if you're a newbie gardener, you think, oh wow, that's great, I'm going to get free soil, free mulch, but you know that you can pick up just about anything in there. And so we learned that frequently in the beginning, a lot of people were getting free mulch from the cities, from the towns, the municipalities, wherever they lived, and this was a source of it. Because if you're a certified mulch dealer, you do turn your windrows, so you keep temperature readings. So don't be afraid to buy, this is certified mulch. They are required under state statute, and they're regulated by the DNR. So it's these that tend to cause problems because you don't hit those optimum temperatures over and over again. Plant cells are wonderful. We don't discourage them. We just encourage people to follow best management practices. And the best management practices is ask your members. So do you have jumping worms? Then don't take part in the plant sale. If you don't have jumping worms, take part in the plant sale. Have information out there. We've had great success in Waukesha, where we're having another really good success story happening in Port Washington, where we have 2 plant groups that are continuing with their plant sale, but they have all of our publications. We made them a poster, and we just encourage them to talk to their members, do self-inspection. They're also having a garden tour, and they know that 3 of the houses have jumping worms. So if you're going on the garden tour, you have to visit the other 4 first, and then you can go to those last 3. Just simple things like that, because dealing with these invasives, that's the best thing that you can do. Bait, we don't use them as bait, and these worms are particular too. So if you were to put them on a fishing hook, given the firmness of their body, you put that fishing hook through them, they would actually sort of pop on you, and so you would have a broken worm, so you would be wearing some worms on you the rest of the day. And we've always had a campaign within the DNR to contain all of your night crawlers, particularly when you're in the northern part of the state, because we do have a really vigorous forest industry up there. There's a lot of jobs tied to it, and so if you toss your bait off the side of the lake, you're introducing more worms into that forest ecosystem, which we discourage. What you can do is just follow the BMPs, and they are really simple. So you're going to watch for those signs. You're going to look for, really active worms like that. You're going to look for that soil signature. You're educating yourself and others. One thing I will say, people that call and say, well, my neighbor has them, am I going to get them? Well, probably, because you can't control animals. You can't control weather. You can't control things moving across. So just be cautious when you're doing this. Ask questions and only use certified mulch soil. And so we have a long form on the DNR, and they have their own division, which is the recycling division, but you can pull it up on the website. And anytime you're doing any type of gardening, you want to clean your equipment, arrive clean, leave clean. We've been working with the nurseries. Nurseries are enacting protocols, so if you're coming to their big facilities, if you happen to be a landscaper, you're going to have to park in a designated area, you're going to have to come in, you're going to have to put on booties before you go into their hoop houses because they don't want any cross-contamination. So they do take it seriously. The green industry has much more, their BMPs are vast compared to ours, and I apologize, this isn't a really good slide, but they do take this seriously because this is their industry. This is their profession, so they're very aware of it and all the other invasives that they're dealing with. Where they're currently in the state, so I updated this map in November of last year, and where it may look sort of scary, you're like, well, there's a lot of counties. Remember that the main counties are really always going to be the populated counties. So when you're looking at this map, it's Milwaukee, it's Waukesha, it's Dane County, because they're really populated. And then you're going to go up to the Fox cities, and then you're going to go over into Eau Claire, and when you're going close to the Twin Cities. So those are where like the big populations are, but that's human population too. So when you see disturbance, and I will say that Waukesha County is dead center, the epicenter of the infestation, but there's more nurseries in Waukesha County than any other county. And there's so much development in that area, so you have disturbance and introduction happening. And so watch where you have human disturbance and you have populations and urban centers, that tends to be where they are. The good thing about this is that you look at the northern part of the state, they're really not up there. We haven't had any positive reports. And that's all due to the work that so many people have, like master gardeners, extension groups, encouraging second landowners, don't take your plants up to your cottage, to your lake home, to your cabin, because you could introduce them into this ecosystem, which we highly discourage, because if you know about emerald ash borer, oak wilt, all the multiple things that is facing the forest, you know that they could be another threat to that. So while it may look bold, really the populations of them are just in those urban areas, and those other counties, they're sporadic. And so we are working on a map right now where it just shows you pinpoints, and the map itself is much less intimidating. So it's just following basic BMPs. Can we kill them? This is the never-ending question that we get. Can we kill them? Well, we are working on research. And so at the Arboretum, we've been really lucky that Katie Lushman, she was one of the first grad students, and she defended last year, and she mapped the entire Arboretum, and hopefully we have another grad student that's going to pick up where she left off. Carly is finishing up her PhD, and she was actually looking at the interaction of these worms with buckthorn, because there's actually a correlation. When you have a lot of these worms, you have buckthorn declining. So, which is a really interesting thing happening with a really aggressive invasive species with a new invasive, and they don't seem to get along that well. Marie is the postdoc, and she is doing some more work this year too, looking at controls for the cocoons, because ideally if we want to get on top of these, we need to control the cocoons. We need to understand how we kill the cocoons before they even become worms. And Brad, who is the ecologist at the Arboretum, he's been looking at early bird, and he did just receive a grant from the Forest Health Group in the DNR, and so he has research money to focus on that entirely this summer, using different applications and rates of early bird. Early bird is a turf fertilizer that they primarily use on golf courses, which kills the worms. So we're hopeful that that will give us some good information, and they have played around with it. So Lisa Johnson, the extension educator for Dayton County, has been trying it. Jeff Epping at Old Brick Garden has been trying it. So we are playing around with that. We don't encourage you to go out and buy it, because you don't know what the long-term residual effects will be. So hopefully we're going to get some really good research and data out of this summer. Another thing that has become a new product in the green industry is biochar. So biochar is, it's been around, they've been using it essentially for thousands of years to amend your soil. So it's basically, you're adding this fertilizer, this amendment to your soil, which is completely natural. I have had landowners up in the Fox Valley that are burning their buckthorn and using that charcoal and applying that almost as their own type of biochar. But biochar this year has been added to a lot of soil mixes, and it's the one drawback of it is when you look at the original research is that it will cause a decline in your earthworm population. So we're hoping if you apply this, it will cause a decline in your jumping worm population. Because basically if you have a lot of jumping worms, you don't have the European earthworms, which you would want in your urban setting. So we're looking at that as well. Lisa's been trying this in her own garden. And I haven't gone to any of the nurseries to really look at the products, but I know it's out there and it's being pushed. And to end this, because I'm right on time, does anything eat them? Well, I've been doing a lot of surveys for years and years and years, and I used to do lots of snake surveys, small mammal surveys, and I was always looking at what things were eating worms. And a lot of things eat worms. If you've ever seen a turtle eat a worm, anyone ever see that? Well, you haven't lived yet, because that is hands down the most incredible thing you will ever see. Look it up on YouTube, because I used to have a turtle and I would feed him worms all the time, and it was the best part of my day. But you can, when you're looking at these different things, so robins eat them, salamanders eating worms too is another really cool thing to see. But in slugs, we could talk about slugs, but we don't have time, and predatory flatworms that eat worms, possums. So I don't know if anyone sees the occasional possum in their yard. They're great. They eat worms, they eat ticks, they do all sorts of incredible things. But with these worms, we've noticed, particularly in the Arboretum, is that a lot of things aren't eating them. And these worms, they can secrete a really distasteful, almost liquid. And so when animals try and eat them, they drop them. Now, one of the inspectors at DACCAP was feeding them to his chickens, and he fed his chickens because chickens will eat them. But then he told me that one of his chickens died, and he said it was because of your worms. I don't think that was it. I think it was probably old age. But chickens will eat them. But another animal that we know is eating them, which is good, is the mole. So your common mole, and how many of you like moles? Nobody likes moles? Well, anyway, I like moles. Moles are really amazing. I know you're all gardeners and you don't like those tunnels and you don't like to see. When I see them, I'm like, oh, wow, we have a mole. Moles are such cute little animals. I mean, how could you not like a mole? They're so cute. And the physiology, the biology of a mole is that they have to eat all the time. So small mammals have to eat. So they're always hungry. And moles, well, they are the number one worm hunter extraordinaire. And right now, I told you it's earthworm mating season. It's also mole mating season. And moles raise pups. And so when moles raise pups, they have to harvest even more worms. So they build these elaborate systems that none of you like in your gardens. But what they do is that they have these little larders. And this is where they store worms. And the cool thing about moles is that, have you ever been bitten by a mole? Bull, shrew, mouse, chipmunk? Anyway, I've been bitten by them all. But when a mole has a neurotoxin in its saliva, and so what happens is that the mole goes out there and it hunts the worm and it grabs onto the worm, and then when it bites it, that neurotoxin is injected into the worm, and so the worm becomes almost like a zombie. So then they take it back to their little larders, which essentially are just little worm cold lockers, and they store dozens of them in there, And so what you can do is you can split open, you can split open one of those larders and you split it open when we used to do mole surveys, and there would just be dozens of these sort of half-dead, suspended animation worms in there because they're hunting them and they're storing them for themselves and for their pups that they're raising. So my new thing is that I tell people, well, if you don't like worms, encourage the moles. And I actually did have a group a few months ago ask me, well, where do I get moles? So with that, we'll leave it right on time. You know more about worms than you ever did before. So questions at all?
So when I'm walking on the sidewalk after a rainstorm, what kind of worms are they, and what should I do?
So they tend to be European earthworms that you're seeing. So you're probably seeing the lumbricid species. You're probably seeing the dendrobanus species. If they're chubbier and fatter, they're probably the night crawlers or the red wigglers. And if you leave them out there, they really only have about 3 to 5 minutes until they can get to shelter because they don't have any pigmentation. And so if you see them and you're feeling, you feeling bad, because who doesn't feel bad when you walk by a worm, and you want to pick it up and you want to take it to a shady area. So you want to put it under some leaves. The same thing happened to me the other day. It was a Friday. I was walking in my town. I was walking the back way, and I walked by, and there was just this one random worm right out there on the sidewalk, and I thought, but no, I passed it, and then I turned around and went back, picked it up, and then took it over to, even though I'm supposed to be telling people how to get rid of worms, don't feel bad. Just pick it up, take it over there. But it's there because it came out because it was flooded, it can't breathe, so it's out there, and then it has to get to shelter because no pigmentation. So you decide what you want to do.
Buy a load of bark to put in there.
With the bark, you need to be a little careful. So ask them where it came from, how long it's been sitting there. Same as mulch. The one thing that we have been encouraging, because emerald ash borer, we've quarantined the state now, and so they've been taking down a lot of ash trees. And then there's a lot of ash chips out there. So we have encouraged people, if you're really concerned and you want to get wood chips, that you should call a tree service, because a lot of tree services have an overabundance of ash chips that they can provide to you. And they just took down the tree, and it's all chopped up. You're safe because it hasn't been contaminated. It hasn't been taken back to a facility and placed anywhere else. So. Some tree services have been really, they like being called because they want to get rid of all of this ash that they have. Yep.
So how do you tell the crumbly soil of one of these worms versus an anthill? So we have a mound underneath 2 of our herbs in our herb garden, and I haven't had the time to dig through it to see what you can see there, but maybe this time of year we wouldn't see the worms anyway. But
Well, you would see the ants, though.
Right.
You definitely see the ants, and the ants are going to come out, and they're going to be, and I have lots of ants too. It's different. It's a different, and they tend to mound up, where
worms don't.
no. What you can do is just drop an Oreo cookie on top, come out the next day, and see what happened. And that'll be a pretty.
Kids out there,
Yeah. Well, yeah, you have to corner it off. But really, if ants, the Oreo will be gone, and you'll think, oh, it's ants.
So it's literally pushing the
Yeah.
herbs out
So
of the garden.
the worms wouldn't probably do that.
No, you have ants. Well, thank you so much. And I did bring, we've made new brochures. And so unfortunately they're not back from the printer yet. So I printed off quite a few. So that's what they'll look like. And you'll be able to order them for free from the DNR probably within the week. They'll be at the warehouse. And we do have a poster. Our website is being redesigned, so you can just report to the web page specifically. And it'll be more interactive this year. So there'll be more pictures, more videos so people don't confuse European and Asian earthworms, because that's where we tend to get a lot of questions and confusion. And just because you have a lot of worms, the world is not ending. The sky isn't falling. It's another invasive. We're learning as we go. So, but thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.